I found the journals in the 3rd month after my husband died, in a box on the high shelf of his closet, behind the winter sweaters. And what I found in them was a man I had lived with for 52 years and loved for 54 and had not, in any of those years, fully known. My name is Catherine. I'm 81 years old. And what I want to tell you today is not about the grief of losing a husband, though the grief was real and large and is still present in the daily texture of my life, but about the specific and stranger grief of discovering, in the months after the losing, that the person you lost was more interior and more complex and more privately alive than the 52 years of living alongside him had shown you, and what that discovery does to the understanding of a marriage and a life, and the question of how well we ever actually know the people we are closest to. I need to tell you about Thomas first, about who he was as I understood him before the journals, because the before is the necessary context for the after. And because the before was genuine, was the real understanding of a real man that 52 years of genuine marriage produces. And I do not want the account of what the journals added to be received as a diminishment of what the marriage was, because it was not a diminishment, and the distinction matters enormously to the accuracy of what I am trying to tell you. Thomas was a quiet man. I want to say that with the full weight of what quiet means when it is the primary characteristic of a person you have known for most of your adult life. When the quiet is not absence but presence, not the quiet of someone who has nothing to say, but the quiet of someone whose relationship with the interior life is so primary and so self-sufficient that the expression of it to the outside world is always somewhat secondary, always somewhat translated, always somewhat less than the full version of what is happening inside. He was the quietest person I have known closely, and I understood his quiet as simply who he was, as the characteristic that organized his personality in the way that any primary characteristic organizes a personality. And I lived with a quiet for 52 years, and loved it, and was sometimes frustrated by it, and always, I think, slightly at the edge of it, always slightly outside the interior that the quiet was the exterior of. We met in 1968 when I was 23 and he was 26 at a dinner party given by mutual friends in Chicago, where we were both living and both working and both in the specific condition of young people who have recently enough graduated from the organized social world of school that the less organized social world of early adulthood still has the quality of something that requires active navigation. I noticed him because he was the person at the dinner party who was most fully present to whoever he was talking to and least performing for the room. And the not performing was, in a room full of young people in the late 1960s who were performing with considerable energy and enthusiasm. The most distinctive thing about him, he was talking to the woman on his left when I first saw him, and whatever she was saying had his complete attention. The specific and unmistakable quality of someone who is actually listening rather than waiting for their turn to speak. And I found the quality remarkable and found him remarkable and spent the rest of the dinner finding ways to end up in conversation with him. We were married in 1971 and we had 40 years in Chicago and then the last 12 in a smaller house in Michigan after his retirement. And the marriage was, by my honest accounting, and by the accounting of the people who knew us, a good one. a genuinely good one. Not perfect and not without the difficulties that any 52-year marriage accumulates across its full length, but grounded in a genuine and durable love, and a genuine and durable respect, and the specific satisfaction of having built a shared life with someone whose company across the decades never lost the quality that had distinguished him at that first dinner party, the quality of being actually present to the person he was with. He was a landscape architect. I want to mention his work because the work is relevant to the journals in a way that I did not understand until I read them. Because the journals showed me how central the work was to the interior life that the quiet was the exterior of. How much of what he thought and felt and cared about most deeply was organized around the relationship between the built environment and the natural one. The relationship that his professional life was organized around and that I had understood as his professional passion without understanding the full depth of what the passion was rooted in, which the journals showed me with a completeness that 52 years of marriage had not. We had 2 children, a daughter named Sarah, born in 1974, and a son named Daniel, born in 1977. And the raising of them was the part of the marriage where Thomas was most visibly himself in the full-bodied sense, where the quiet opened into something more expressive than the quiet usually permitted, where I could see the interior most clearly because the children produced in him a quality of pure and unmanaged delight that the more composed versions of himself that he presented to the adult world did not produce in the same form. He was magnificent with them when they were small, magnificent in the specific sense of a quiet man who becomes fully present and fully expressed in the company of small people who do not require the management of the presentation. He died in October of 2021. At the age of 79, from a cancer that was diagnosed in the spring and that moved with the efficiency of something that has been forming quietly for a long time and that, once visible, does not delay. We had 8 months from the diagnosis to the death, and the 8 months were not wasted, were in fact the most consistently present and most genuinely intimate 8 months of the marriage. The months in which the approach of the end produced in both of us a quality of attention to each other and to the days that the fullness of the life had not always permitted, and I am grateful for those months with a depth of gratitude that is proportional to what I understand. Looking back, they contained. He did not tell me about the journals. I want to say that clearly because the not telling is part of what I have been sitting with across the 2 years since I found them. The question of whether the not telling was deliberate or simply the natural privacy of a private man, whether he intended the journals to remain unread or whether their existence on the high shelf of his closet was a form of availability and leaving of them in a place that I would eventually find them. And the question does not have an answer, and I have had to make peace with the not, which I have done imperfectly and which I continue to work on. The box was a shoebox, a plain cardboard shoebox that had been used and reused to the point where the brand name was no longer fully legible. And inside it were 11 notebooks, different sizes and different covers, spanning, as I determined from the dates inside the front covers, from 1979 to 2020, 41 years of writing that I had not known existed, that Thomas had been producing alongside the life we shared, without my knowledge of the producing. I sat on the floor of his closet for a long time before I opened the first one. I want to tell you about the sitting because the sitting was its own experience, distinct from the reading that followed it, the experience of holding the 11 notebooks and understanding, before I had read a word of them, that they represented a version of my husband that the marriage had not given me access to. A version that had been present and alive and producing itself in written form across 41 years of the life we shared, and that the presence of this version alongside the version I had known raised the question that I was not certain I was ready to have answered, which was what the version I had known had not included, and whether the not including was a withholding or simply the natural limitation of any person's ability to bring the full interior into the shared life. I opened the first notebook, which was from 1979, 8 years into the marriage. The year Daniel was 2 years old and Sarah was 5, and Thomas had recently made the transition from working for a large firm to starting his own practice, which had been a significant and somewhat frightening professional step that I had understood at the time, primarily in terms of the professional risk and the financial implications and the practical adjustments that a major career change requires. The first entry I read was dated March of 1979, and it was about none of those things. It was about a stand of oak trees on the property of a client in the northern suburbs. Trees that Thomas had been hired to work around in the design of a garden. And the entry was not a professional note, was not a practical account of a landscape architect thinking about how to incorporate existing trees into a new design, but something else entirely. The extended and detailed meditation of a man who was genuinely moved by the specific quality of those trees in the specific quality of the morning light of that particular March day, who was in the presence of something he found beautiful and significant, and who was writing about it with a precision and a feeling that I had not heard him express in conversation, that the quiet had always kept at a level of expression that did not include this fullness, this particular depth of engagement with what the world produced in him when he was fully attending to it. I read for 3 hours that first afternoon. Not all 11 notebooks. I did not have the capacity for all 11 notebooks in a single afternoon, but the 1979 notebook completely, and then the early sections of the 1982 notebook, and then, in the way that the reading of something that is new and significant produces the specific fatigue of encountering more than you have yet had the capacity to process, I stopped and sat with what I had read and tried to understand what I was understanding. What I was understanding in those first 3 hours was that Thomas had a relationship with the world, with the natural world specifically, but with the world more broadly, that was considerably more interior and more alive and more specifically felt than anything the 52 years of our life together had fully revealed to me. He had the relationship in full. I could see it in the writing. And what I had received across 52 years was the translated version. The version that the quiet produced when the interior reached the surface, which was warmer and more present than many people's surface, but which was, I could see clearly now, always somewhat reduced from the full interior, always somewhat less than what the interior contained. I want to describe some of what I found in the journals because the description is the honest part, and because the specific things I found are more true to the experience than any general account of the discovery would be. I found that Thomas had been writing about me for 41 years. This was the first thing that produced in me the specific quality of grief that the journals generated that was distinct from the ordinary grief of the losing. The grief that was not about the absence, but about the presence, about discovering what had been there all along. He wrote about me with a specificity and a tenderness that the marriage had given me across 52 years, in forms that were genuine but different, in the practical and daily and expressed forms of a man who was loving and present and considerate. And the writing was the same love in a different form, the interior form, the form that the choir had always kept at the level below the expression. And reading it was like hearing a piece of music I had known for 50 years suddenly played in the original key. The same music, but fuller, more complex, more completely itself. In an entry from 1991, he wrote about watching me in the kitchen on a Sunday morning from the doorway of the hall. Watching me make coffee and read the newspaper and be simply present in the ordinary morning in the way that a person is present in the ordinary morning when they do not know they are being observed. And what he wrote was not a description of what he saw exactly, but a description of what the seeing produced in him. The specific and detailed account of the feeling of watching the person you love in the version of themselves that ordinary domestic mornings produce. And the detail of the account and the quality of the feeling it described showed me something about the quality of his attention to me across the years, that the years themselves had given me in a different and less articulated form. I read that entry 4 times, not looking for something I had missed, but staying with what was there, staying with the experience of being seen by someone across 52 years in a form I had not known the seeing had taken, and the staying was its own form of grief and its own form of something that is not grief. Something for which I do not have a single word, but that is in the neighborhood of being known, of finding evidence of being known more fully than you had understood yourself to be known. And the evidence arriving after the person who knew you is no longer present to be told that the knowing has been received. He wrote about the children with the same quality, and reading those entries produced in Sarah and Daniel, when I eventually shared selected portions with them, responses that were different from each other and both genuine. Sarah crying in the way of someone who has been given something she did not know she had been wanting. Daniel sitting very quietly in the way of his father and reading and rereading in the way I had reread the kitchen entry, staying with what was there. There was an entry from 1985 about Daniel at 8 years old. About a specific afternoon the two of them had spent building something in the backyard, some construction of wood and string that had no practical purpose and that had consumed an entire Saturday afternoon. And the entry was about what Thomas had felt in the building of it. The specific quality of being fully present in an ordinary afternoon with his son, and the feeling he described was the feeling of sufficiency. The sense that the afternoon was complete and self-contained and required nothing outside itself to justify the spending of it. And the writing of it was the most articulate account of what I have heard elsewhere called presence, but that Thomas described without that word. Described through the specific and particular afternoon, and the specific and particular boy, and the specific and particular quality of the late September light in the backyard. And the description produced the thing it described, rather than simply naming it. I want to tell you about what I found in the journals that was harder to read, because the journals did not contain only the beautiful and the tender, and the honest account of the finding requires the harder parts as well. There were entries about the marriage in which Thomas wrote about things that the marriage had not given him. Things he had wanted from me or from us that had not materialized in the form he had wanted them. And the reading of those entries was the most difficult experience the journals produced. Not because the wanting was accusatory. It was not because it expressed resentment or disappointment in a form that was harsh or unfair, but because it showed me the specific places where the interior life I was now reading about had reached toward the marriage and had found the reaching only partially met, had found me partially present in the way that I was, in my own interior, sometimes only partially present, and the partial meeting of the partial reaching had produced, across years and in the form of the journal entries rather than the conversation, a quality of quiet accommodation that was not unhappy and was not resentful, but that was, I could see clearly now, the accommodation of a man who had made peace with the distance between what he had and what he had wanted, and who had made that peace without the conversation that might have addressed the distance. I want to sit with this because it is the most important and the most complicated thing the journals showed me. The thing I have been working with most seriously across the 2 years since I found them. Thomas had wanted more of me than I had given him. Not more love. The love was present, and he wrote about it clearly. But more of the specific quality of interior exchange that the journals showed me he was capable of, and that the quiet had never brought fully into the marriage. He had wanted the conversation that the journals were having with themselves, had wanted to have it with me rather than only with the page. And the wanting was present in the entries across years and decades, and was accompanied, always, by the accommodation of the wantings not being met, rather than the raising of it into the conversation between us. This is where I have had to be most honest with myself, because the reading of the wanting could produce the conclusion that the withholding was all on his side, that the quiet was the reason the interior exchange did not happen, and the honest accounting does not support that conclusion. I was not a person who made the interior exchange easy. I was warm and I was present in the ways that I was present, and I was not always available for the specific quality of depth and directness that the journals showed me. Thomas was capable of wanting, and that the journals also showed me he had, partly in response to my availability and partly in response to his own formation, learned not to bring to the surface, because the surface, our shared surface, was organized around other things. We had organized the surface together. That is the honest account, and the honest account is the one the journals produced in me, rather than the simpler account in which the undisclosed interior was simply a characteristic of Thomas, rather than the product of a dynamic between us that I had participated in creating. I had participated in the creating. I am certain of this, and I have had to sit with the certainty, had to hold the understanding that the man I did not fully know was also partly a man I had not fully invited to be known, had not always created the conditions for the kind of depth of exchange that the journals showed me he was privately capable of, and that the journal was partly a record of what went inward because the outward direction was not consistently available. This understanding has been the most significant thing the journals have produced in me across the 2 years of the living with them. More significant than the grief of the discovery, and more lasting than the warmth of finding the kitchen entry and the building in the backyard, and entry and the 41 years of being written about with the specific tenderness of a man who noticed everything and said less than he noticed. The most significant thing is the understanding that the person I did not fully know was not fully unknown, because he kept himself private, but partly because I had not, across 52 years, fully invited the knowing. I want to be careful about this understanding and about how I am presenting it, because I am not interested in the version of this account that converts the discovery of the journals into a story of marital failure or into an indictment of either Thomas or myself, because the marriage was not a failure and the account is not an indictment, and the distinction matters. The marriage was what it was. A genuine and durable and deeply loving 52-year relationship between two people who were each partially known to the other and who built a full and real life together in the partial knowing. And the partial knowing was not a deficiency in the marriage exactly, but a limitation of the human capacity for full disclosure. The limitation that every relationship has and that every person has. The limitation of the interior that is always somewhat larger than what any relationship contains, and that goes somewhere, either to the page or to the somewhere else, when it exceeds the container. Thomas took it to the page. That is what the journals are, the overflow of the interior that exceeded the container of the shared life. And the overflow was not a rejection of the shared life, but a supplement to it, the place where the interior could be fully itself without the translation that the shared life required. And the translation is always somewhat reduced from the original, which is the fundamental condition of human intimacy, the gap between the interior and its expression. The gap that no closeness can fully close. I have been reading the journals slowly across 2 years, not all at once, but in the way that something important deserves to be read, with the attention and the space that allows what is there to be fully received rather than processed efficiently toward a conclusion. I have read all 11 notebooks now. All 41 years of the overflow. And what I have in the reading of them is a version of Thomas that is more complete than the version I had before. And the more complete version is not a different man from the man I knew, but the same man with the interior visible. The same man I loved for 54 years, with the translation removed. And the translation removed is both the gift the journals have given me and the source of the specific grief they generate. Because the man with the translation removed is a man I can only know in retrospect, can only receive at the remove of the page and the death, and the 2 years of the sitting with what the page contains. I want to tell you about a specific entry that I have returned to more than any other. Not the most beautiful entry and not the most revelatory, but the one that has most consistently produced in me, in the returning, the specific quality of understanding I most want to try to communicate to you. It was written in November of 2015, 6 years before his death, when Thomas was 70 years old and I was 67, and we had been married for 44 years. It was not a long entry, was in fact one of the shorter entries in the 11 notebooks. And it was about nothing more extraordinary than an evening we had spent at home. An ordinary Tuesday evening, of the kind that ordinary long marriages are made of. The two of us in the living room after dinner, Thomas reading and me doing something I no longer remember. And the entry was about the quality of that evening, the specific and complete quality of an ordinary Tuesday in a long marriage. And what Thomas wrote about it was that it was enough, was completely and entirely enough, was the thing itself rather than a version of the thing or a preparation for the thing or a substitute for some other thing that was not available, and that the being enough of it was something he wanted to record because he did not always say it and was afraid, in the not saying, that the not saying might be received as the not feeling. He was afraid I did not know that the ordinary Tuesday evenings were enough for him. He was afraid that the quiet, the characteristic and pervasive quiet that organized his exterior life, might be received from the outside as the quiet of someone who is merely tolerating the life rather than the quiet of someone who is in full possession of it and at peace with it and grateful for it in a way that the quiet was not adequately expressing. He was writing it down because the saying of it to me was something the quiet made difficult and the not saying was something that had begun to worry him. I did not know. I want to say that honestly, I had understood the ordinary Tuesday evenings as good as the comfortable and warm evenings of a good marriage, and I had understood Thomas's quiet in them as the comfortable quiet of a man who was content. But the specific quality of what he wrote, the enough, the completely and entirely enough, the thing itself, was not something I had known with the clarity and the completeness that the journal entry contained it. And the not knowing discovered 2 years after his death in the 3rd month of the grief was the specific form of the loss that the journals produced that was unlike any other form of the loss of the conversation that the entry had been written in place of. The conversation that would have given me what the entry gave me while he was still present to receive my response to it. I have thought about that entry in the context of what I understand now about the dynamic between us, about the surface we organized together and the interior that the surface did not always invite. And the understanding I arrive at is not that Thomas was prevented from saying what the entry contained, not that I would have received it badly or that the marriage could not have held it, but that the saying of it required a quality of willingness to be interior in the shared space that the formation of a quiet man and the shared surface we had built together made difficult. And the difficulty had been sufficient across years and decades to root the saying to the page rather than to me. The conversation happened anyway. That is what I find myself returning to when the grief of the not having dwell here is most present. The conversation happened anyway, in the 11 notebooks, in the 41 years of the overflow, and it is available to me in the form the page gives it, which is not the form of the mutual exchange, is not the form that would have allowed him to receive my response and for the response to have changed something between us, but is the form of being fully received into what he thought and felt and cared about and noticed and loved, which is a form of intimacy that is real and that the 2 years of the reading have given me in a way I am still in the process of understanding. I am at peace with Thomas in a way that is different from the peace I had with him during the marriage, and that is, in certain specific ways, more complete. Not because the journals resolved anything that the marriage had left unresolved. The journals are not a resolution, but because the journals gave me a more complete version of the man to be at peace with, and the completeness changes the peace in the direction of the more full and the more honest, the peace of someone who is in possession of the fuller account rather than the peace of someone who has accepted the partial account as the whole one. I want to say something to you about what all of this has taught me about the people we are closest to, and what we actually know of them, and what we do not know, and what that means for how we are in the relationships while they are still ongoing. while the conversation is still possible and the response can still be received. The interior of the person you are closest to is not fully available to you. I want to start with that as the simple fact it is. The fact that the journals showed me with a completeness I had not previously had, because I think the assumption of the opposite, the assumption that closeness across years and decades produces the full knowing of the other person, is one of the assumptions most worth examining and most worth releasing. The interior of the person you love most is always somewhat larger than what the relationship contains. The translation from the interior to the expressed is always somewhat reduced from the original. The person you have known for 30 or 40 or 50 years is also, simultaneously, a person you have not fully known. And the not fully knowing is not a failure of the relationship but a condition of it, the fundamental condition of all human intimacy, which operates always at the translation rather than the original. What this means in practical terms, which is the only terms I am interested in at 81, is that the question worth asking in any relationship that matters to you is not whether you know the person fully, because the answer to that question is always no, but whether you are creating the conditions in which more of the interior can reach the surface than would reach it without the conditions. Whether the shared space between you is organized in a way that invites the fuller version rather than the translated one. Whether the person you love feels, in your presence and in the texture of the daily life you share, that the interior is welcome at the surface and that the bringing of it forward will be received rather than managed or redirected or left to root itself to the page because the shared space was not organized to hold it. Thomas rooted things to the page that could have come to me. I accept my part in the rooting. I am not saying this to punish myself or to convert the journals into an indictment of my conduct in the marriage. I am saying it because it is the honest account and because the honest account is more useful to you than the comfortable one. Because the comfortable one does not ask you to do anything and the honest one asks you to look at whether the person you love most is rooting things to the page because the space you share has not been organized to hold what the page holds. Ask them. That is the practical form of everything the journals have taught me. The reduction of 2 years of sitting with 11 notebooks into the single action that is still available to you. If the person you love is still present and the conversation is still possible, ask them what is in the journal they are not keeping or the journal they are keeping. Ask them what the interior contains that the translation has not yet brought to the shared surface. Ask them what they have wanted to say that the quiet or the management or the shared surface has made difficult to say. And receive the answer with the full and undistracted attention that Thomas brought to the woman on his left at the dinner party in 1968. The attention of someone who is actually listening rather than waiting for their turn to speak. He was the best listener I have ever known. Thomas, the most genuinely present to whoever he was with. And the journals showed me that the interiority, that the quiet enclosed was as present and as attending as the listening was the same quality in the inward direction that the listening was in the outward. And I had known the outward version for 52 years and the inward version for 2. And I am grateful for both. And I am here to tell you that the inward version, whatever form it takes in the person you love, is worth finding while the finding is still possible. While the conversation can still go both ways. while the receiving of what you find can still be received by the person who was doing the producing of it all along, in the quiet, in the overflow, in the place below the translation, where the full interior lives and where, in the case of my husband, it was alive and present and attending to me with a completeness that I am still, at 81 and 2 years into the reading, in the process of fully receiving. He knew the Tuesday evenings were enough. He wanted me to know that he knew I know it now. I wish he were here to know that I know it, to receive the response that the entry was written in place of, to have the conversation that the journal had with itself for 41 years. But the knowing is real, and the receiving is real. And the 2 years of reading the overflow have given me a version of Thomas that I will carry for whatever time I have remaining, with the fullness that the translation could not quite contain. Across 52 years of a good and genuine and partially known and deeply loved life, it was enough. It was completely and entirely enough, and I know that now.